Today, I won't start with loud statements, but with a story. A story that not only deserves to be heard, it demands it. Imagine a girl in Africa. She's only 10 years old. Defenseless little Rosie, with no one to take care of her. Her home is a small town in Tanzania. Every day is a day of hard work to survive, and there's no support whatsoever. No shoulder she could lean on. Then, suddenly, a small ray of hope appears in her life. A white man from Europe comes and says he will help. "I'll take you to school. Your life will change," he promised the girl with a broad smile. She was supposed to play carefree, study, and dream, but instead, a dark page began in her life. The man who called himself a volunteer, a protector of society, the one they believed and trusted, committed a heinous act. He didn't save Rosie as he promised. He destroyed her childhood. When Rosie, a small frightened girl, faced with an adult man and his insane gaze, tried to escape, scream, fight for her life and honor, he cut her with a knife. In the end, the girl did manage to escape, but before she could break free, he managed to rape her. Where is she now, several years later? Still on the streets of Tanzania. She is now 14, and her life is still mere survival. Every day she works hard for a piece of bread. And every day she lives with the painful memories of the white man from Europe. This is a true story. Her rapist is also real. He is not a nameless criminal from a criminal chronicle. He has a name. And his victims testify in the documentary whose title you now see on the screen. Jacob Yal came to Tanzania under the guise of a humanitarian worker. According to the local residents of the region where he lived at the time, Yal primarily collected online donations and contributions from European citizens and spent them on parties with drugs, paid sexual services, according to some testimonies with underage boys, and also blackmail and bribes for personal purposes. He publicly claimed to be running an orphanage and caring for African orphans. In reality, however, the children themselves, in the presence of adults, told journalists that Jacob Yal repeatedly screamed at the children, beat them, walked around naked in front of them, locked himself in a closed room with the boys, and injected them with an unknown substance. But the worst part is the story I began this video with. Rosie herself told it in the documentary film prepared by independent investigative journalists titled "The Victims of Jacob Yal in Africa." Now you know the name of the man who, based on the victims' testimonies, committed unimaginable atrocities. So tell me, what are you thinking about at the moment? That this pedophile is probably in prison since the public knows about him? No. Do you think he's hiding? No. He doesn't just walk freely along the streets of Europe. Today, this man is invited to television as an expert on cults. He studies to become a teacher at the most prestigious university in the Czech Republic. He actively runs his social media pages where he smiles broadly and merrily talks about his travels and dances. Bloggers quote him, and his schizophrenic books are published on book websites. Most strikingly, he teaches society how to distinguish a threat and exposes alleged terrible cults and sects. Now, I have a question. How is that even possible? How can a man who has committed such an unimaginable atrocity be regarded as a moralist and an expert? How can he tell society who is dangerous and who is not when he himself is a real danger not only to society, but most importantly, to our children? At this point, we should stop and think because the story I started with isn't just a scary incident somewhere out there in Africa. The villain who committed violence against Rosie, it turns out, is a link in an entire network. A system that has been growing for decades, hiding behind grand slogans of security, protection of society, and the fight against cults and sects. This is a system that today is destroying the lives of innocent people and children, not only in Africa, but also in Europe, Russia, the United States, and even China. This system has a name. The names of its leaders and followers are known, and some of them will be voiced in this video today. And as for how many victims this network has, how many other small, defenseless children there are like Rosie, we can only guess. I'm talking about a network that hides behind the noble mask of fighters for truth. But thousands of facts gathered from around the world testify that it brings only suffering, hatred, and destruction. Members of this network are masters of manipulation. They know perfectly well how to use a mask of virtue to commit evil. Today, I will rip this mask off. I will tell you about the only truly horrific totalitarian sect of maniacs, sadists, and pedophiles that has operated with impunity for decades. You may not suspect it, but their representatives could be right next to you. They could be your neighbors, your colleagues. They could be in the newsrooms of the media you read over breakfast. They could be among the politicians you plan to vote for in the elections. They could be your children's teachers. They are everywhere. They manipulate large foundations, including USAID and the Open Society foundations. They infiltrate governments, courts, mass media, and most importantly, the minds of millions of people. It's a network you might know under the seemingly attractive banner of fighters against cults and sects. But what we are seeing could more accurately be called a well-established, transnational black business and mafia-like entity. It is the entity that traffics in hatred, destroys lives, and undermines the very foundations of a democratic society. And the goal of this entity is to establish total power. By directly impacting people's rights and freedoms, they are, in fact, subverting the laws of the very state they have infiltrated. We already see an example of this in Russia. Under the pretext of public interest and protecting society from threats, for more than 30 years they have been shaping and reviving Nazi ideology not only within Russian society, but are now spreading it to many democratic states. They create blacklists of undesirable groups, organizations, and individuals in order to pull people, step by step, into a cult of superiority. It was precisely this sense of one's group's superiority over another that once turned the intelligent citizens of Germany into Nazis, ready to exterminate people simply because they were allegedly inferior. Forget everything you've heard about the fight against cults. That's just a marketing wrapper, a cover. The real product this network sells to its clients is destruction. You might be thinking, what's so frightening and dangerous about that? So what? A handful of anti-cult fighters. But to understand the full scale of this network's danger, you need to look at who leads it. Who is the example and model for every follower of this sect, including Jakob Jarl, whom I spoke about at the beginning? Who is the main ideological inspirer of the phenomenon that has already brought Russia, practically speaking, to a dictatorial regime? If you've watched my previous videos, then the name of this man, the leader of this network, is already familiar to you. It's Alexander Dworkin, the most famous sectologist in Russia, an expert on sects and cults, a historian, and a theologian. He is also the author of the book Sectology, the Bible for every member of his network. Look at him. What do you see? Just an old man? Some professor with a pretentious gaze? Nothing unusual. And here you see an altar reader in an Orthodox church who, instead of preaching the Word of God to parishioners, delivers, in this case, rather, the word of Dworkin. But there is something not mentioned in Alexander Dworkin's official regalia. Something he carefully hides and it is no hurry to comment on, let alone deny. Because these facts clearly reflect the very essence of the entire system he has built and the followers with whom he has surrounded himself. He is called a respected Orthodox theologian, but Orthodox priests are forced, out of fear for their lives, to anonymously publish their testimonies about who Alexander Dworkin really is. As one of them said in the video, if in the church someone whom Dworkin had targeted dared to oppose his perversions, homosexuality, and feces eating, they were simply expelled or stripped of defrocked. But there's more. Other anonymous testimonies that have surfaced online state that the respected professor of sectology forced his students into cruel, perverse sexual practices involving feces. Disgusting, revolting, horrifying. Think about how the people must feel who come to church to hear a sermon, to find inspiration and lift their spirits. And instead, the gospel is being read to them by a coprophile. Who knows what his hands were touching before they picked up the Holy Scripture? What is it like for students to come into the lecture hall and be forced to sit closer to the blackboard because all the back seats are already taken? Everyone hurries to sit as far away as possible from the unbearable stench coming from the professor. Well, the stench, that's still the least of it. But what if he takes a liking to you? According to the account of a student who anonymously told the story of his friend, if Dworkin sets his sight on you, escaping is practically impossible. Yet, Dworkin teaches at institutions where there are students who have not reached adulthood. Can you imagine what these boys are going through? But there is another interesting point. According to the conclusion of an independent, comprehensive, forensic, psychological, and psychiatric evaluation conducted back in 1999, Dworkin was diagnosed with a whole bunch of conditions: cyclothymia, pathological personality development, and psychophysical infantilism with suspected schizophrenia. Don't be too quick to write him off as a schizophrenic and justify his perversions as the result of mental illness. His genius lies in the fact that he skillfully exploits even that. He created an entire mechanism of control and psychological subjugation based on his dependence on coprophilia, which directly helps him exert broad influence over power structures. the judicial system, and law enforcement agencies in Russia and beyond. In one of my previous videos, The Taste of Power, I analyzed in detail what Dworkin's power is built on, the secret initiation into his sect, the act of feces eating, which became compromising material and a tool of blackmail against the necessary figures who later took key positions in the government. We will come back to this. In his works, although it is difficult to call them works given the degree of plagiarism and borrowing from his Nazi ideologues, he vividly and in detail describes the signs and characteristics of a totalitarian sect. And that is where his main monstrous irony lies. Because if we take his own methodology, his own criteria as an expert on sects and cults, and apply them to his own organization, we see that the most accurate and complete description of a totalitarian sect is the description of his own international anti-cult network. So as not to be unfounded, let's just go through his own statements. Dworkin asserts that the sectarian organizations resemble a very rigid, totalitarian political party, or an organized mafia entity. Now let's look at his network. It is a perfectly constructed, multi-level pyramid of power. At the top of the pyramid is the Center for Religious Studies in the name of the holy martyr Irenaeus of Lyons. Paradoxically, the official task of this center is postulated as follows: to spread reliable information about the teachings and activities of totalitarian sects and destructive cults. For this purpose, the staff of the center engage in research, consulting, lectures, and publishing activities, and they also maintain contact with government agencies and the mass media. What is not mentioned on the website is that research, consulting, and lectures in practice literally mean collective psychological terror, incitement to hatred, and propaganda of Nazi ideology of superiority. As a matter of fact, the Center for Religious Studies is Dworkin's personal ideological base, his headquarters from which he spreads his doctrine. The center is part of Ratsirs, the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects. It's an umbrella organization that coordinates dozens of branches of Dworkin's sect, both in Russia and abroad. The president of this association is, of course, Dworkin himself, and the vice president is Archpriest Alexander Novopashin, Dworkin's close friend and right-hand man. Novopashin serves as a kind of a mouthpiece for Dworkin's radicalism. Everything the highly respected, esteemed historian and professor cannot say himself is voiced by Orthodox Church leader Alexander Novopashin. Let me remind you, this is the man who calls Ukrainians cannibals and openly calls for their extermination. The international facade of his network is FECRIS, the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Sectarianism. For many years, Dworkin was its vice president, which gave his network international cover and a false sense of legitimacy. This organization is 90% funded by the French government and, most shockingly, has consultative status at the UN and the Council of Europe. Think about it. An entity with a leader, strict hierarchy, regional brigades, and an international cover is funded with European taxpayers' money. Doesn't this resemble that very mafia-style structure which Dvorkin himself compared sectarian organizations to? In part, their activities could be described as a classic business model with its own goals, products, and beneficiaries. The goal? Establishing total control over public opinion and law enforcement. Creating a monopoly on truth, where only they decide who is right and who is a sectarian. Their product is a full range of services aimed at destroying lives. They sell ruined reputations, stripping parents of child custody in divorce cases, division of property, fabrication of criminal charges, and branding people as extremists and spies. It is a factory for producing social outcasts. The result? The undermining of fundamental rights and freedoms guaranteed by the constitutions of all civilized nations. Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and the right to a fair trial. And if all of this sounds like theory so far, let's look at how it works in practice. There is a story of a certain woman named Alina Brezem. She's an ordinary, divorced woman, a mother of two, an entrepreneur who honestly earned her living. She worked for Herbalife, rented an apartment, took care of her children, and started building a new relationship. By societal standards, she was doing well. Her children were well-mannered. She had a stable income. She was simply living her life and planning for the future. But one day, her ex-husband decided he wanted to take their son. And at that moment, Dvorkin and his network entered her life. Imagine this. You go to court confident that justice is on your side. You have never broken the law. Your children study. You earn money through honest work. And suddenly, against you, pseudo-expert evaluation, with official-looking stamps allegedly stating, Herbalife is a sect, and you are an adherent. At court, witnesses appear, but they are not your neighbors, colleagues, or acquaintances. They are people you've never seen. Alexander Dvorkin himself, his lawyer, Karelov, who surprisingly represented the interests of her ex-husband, Yevgeny Oshmarin, deputy head of the missionary department of the local diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church, all from the same organization, Ratziers. And all of them unanimously declare you are a cultist, even though they don't know you. Absurd? No. It is a real plan. In this plan, the same actors always appear, manipulating expert reports, acting as witnesses, and creating a false reality. The key point is that Alina decided to figure out on her own what she was dealing with. She called Ratziers, introduced herself as a woman whose husband was allegedly a cultist, and they politely explained their operational plan based on falsifying expert reports, documents, and false testimony, all for a certain fee. If that's not enough, Plan B comes into play. In Alina's case, they tried to have her declared mentally ill and placed into a clinic. Imagine this, a mother of two, with a stable job, income, family, and most importantly, mental health, suddenly threatened with being locked up in a psychiatric facility. And all of this for what? For the interests of the client, in her case, her ex-husband. He had the motive, he had the money. And if you think Alina Brezem's situation is a coincidence, you are deeply mistaken. It is a system, The exact same scheme, the same methods, the same on-call experts, repeated dozens, hundreds of times. According to available anonymous sources, the very same anti-cult agent in the Czech Republic, Jakub Jal, uses the exact same scheme. There are testimonies that he most often seeks out men who are dissatisfied with their wives or ex-partners, and then advises and encourages them on how to properly accuse their partner of cultism and how to navigate law enforcement and the judicial system. Simply put, Jal provided guidance and support on how to sue their partners based on accusations that they supposedly belong to a cult. Can you imagine that? This is exactly how the network of these so-called anti-cult fighters operates. Now you see for yourself that it is far from being about protecting society. From the legal perspective, lawyers and psychologists call this mobbing. Imagine a legal system that, in theory, should protect the vulnerable, is turned into a weapon of attack. Court cases, expert reports, witness testimony, all of it is triggered not to find the truth, but to destroy the victim's life. Simply put, the court is presented with scientific works written by Dvorkin himself and his students. Pseudo-expert evaluations are conducted by loyal specialists from his own association. Witnesses appear who have never met Alina in their lives, yet confidently declare that she's in a sect. Then another tool is used: pressure through psychiatry, fabricated suspicions of insanity, attempts to commit the woman to a clinic and strip her of her legal capacity. Think about how terrifying that is. In a single day, a successful entrepreneur and caring mother is transformed into an abnormal person, deemed unfit even to care for her own children. Experts call it institutional gaslighting, wherein an entire system convinces the victim and those around them that the problem is not the act of violence committed against them, whether psychological or physical, but rather the victim themselves. In this case, the husband is supposedly not guilty of abducting the child, and the group of agents is supposedly not falsifying evidence. Instead, it is the mother who is allegedly dangerous and unstable because she's a cultist. The most insidious part is the effect of the endless legal proceedings. A person spends years running between courts and lawyers and dealing with expert evaluations, instead of living, working, and raising children. It resembles a military strategy where one party tries to gradually wear down the opponent until they are completely exhausted. This strategy is called a war of attrition. You don't have to win quickly. You can just drain the victims of every resource: emotional, financial, and temporal. That's exactly what Dvorkin and his network are doing. And here we see the essence. Dvorkin's network doesn't actually fight against cults and sects. It professionally destroys people upon receiving an order. Not once, not by accident, but systematically and methodologically. The stigma of a cultist, dehumanization, falsification of evidence, control of experts, pressure through psychiatry, and endless self-perpetuating bureaucratic procedures. Alina Brezum is only one of the victims of this entity. But how many more are there? How many mothers, fathers, entrepreneurs, scholars, politicians, journalists, and activists? How many courtrooms in Russia and beyond have witnessed this scenario? The stigma of occultists, dehumanization, falsified evaluations, pressure through psychiatry, and exhaustion through endless legal procedures. Now, pay attention. The very document that was used in Alina Brezem's case as an expert report has survived in the archives. The same one that nearly turned a healthy, competent, and loving mother into a mentally ill individual. The same one that almost deprived children of their mother. Look at it. It looks official, doesn't it? Seals, signatures, numbers, stamps. Everything seems neat, clean, and formal. But if you look at it more carefully, this document alone is enough to reveal what lies beneath the legal veneer, the rotten core of Dvorkin's network. The request for an expert evaluation came from, guess who? From the lawyer of Alina's ex-husband, Korelov. The addressee is indicated as attorney of the Moscow Region Bar Association, A.A. Korelov. Now, please note, Korelov isn't just the lawyer of Brezem's ex-husband. Now, please note, Korolov isn't just the lawyer of Brezem's ex-husband. He is also the chairman of the Legal Committee for the Protection of Personal Rights and Dignity at Ratsiers, under the leadership of Dvorkin. And that's where the theater of absurdity begins. Dvorkin's lawyer writes a request to Dvorkin himself, and Dvorkin signs this expert report. In other words, a lawyer from the network appeals to the leader of this network for an evaluation. And the leader of the network confirms his own words, based on literature he himself has published. And then Dvorkin himself, on the basis of his own pseudo-expert evaluation, appears as a witness in the trial of a woman he had never seen before. Question: can you call this an expert evaluation? Can you call it justice? Or is it a well-staged play with all the roles assigned in advance? But what exactly was so valuable for the court in this document? A scientific study? A legal analysis? No. It was nothing more than a compilation of the results of the conference's Totalitarian Sects, Threat of the 21st Century, that took place in Nizhny Novgorod in 2001, and Totalitarian Sects and the Democratic State of 2004. Essentially, it was just a retelling of those conferences, or simply put, roundtables of anti-cultists where the same familiar faces from the anti-cult network gathered and decided who they wanted to label as dangerous. Under this list, you won't find signatures of dozens of scholars, lawyers, or experts. No, only the signature of Dvorkin himself. And Dvorkin pompously calls the results of those conferences final declarations. Any lawyer, or even just a reasonable person, would say, such a document has no legal force whatsoever and cannot have it. It's not an expert report. It's an equivalent of taking a high school essay titled, "Whom I Consider a Cultist," stamping it with a seal and submitting it to a court as an expert evidence. Yet, this absurd artifact nearly deprived Alina of her children. However, the most frightening part is that this wasn't an isolated case. Similar documents, drafted on the basis of anti-cult conferences, were used by Dvorkin's network more than once. There's a whole technology, fabricating expert evaluations, that later become a foundation of court cases and serve as a weapon in the fight against those who are deemed undesirable. Anti-cultists themselves create precedents, attach stigmatizing labels, compile so-called blacklists of cults and sects, and then use them as supposed evidence, citing themselves as authorities. Based on the materials you see on the screen, it is obvious that the resolutions from Dvorkin's totalitarian sect, with its extremist and terrorist ideology, are presented as if they were decisions of legislative body or a scholarly community, which must be followed. Please note, It is no coincidence that the 2001 conference, Totalitarian Sects, Threat of the 21st Century, remains Dworkin's main trump card to this day. He repeatedly uses its outcomes as a basis for his pseudo-expert reports because it was precisely there that he managed to gather unprecedented number of anti-cult activists in Russia under one roof. Look at these lists and names. Many of the speakers were representatives of Fekris, or rat-seers. At first glance, it might seem like just a company of dry academic geeks obsessed with anti-cult themes. But in reality, these are Dworkin's tentacles, through which he extends his ideological web far beyond Russia. Formally, they declare, we're discussing the threat to society posed by cults and sects. But what was actually happening behind the closed doors of those conferences? In fact, they were carriers of Dworkin's destructive, deadly extremist and terrorist ideology in democratic countries. And it was no accident that the ideological inspiration behind Dworkin himself attended this Russian conference. Now let's take a closer look at this photograph. Do you recognize the face circled in red? Most likely not. But what if I told you that this conference became pivotal for Dworkin precisely because it was attended by the follower and successor of the methodology of those who directly shaped the ideology of Nazism? The gray-haired man on the left in the photograph is Johannes Agard, the man who became both a teacher and an object of near-religious veneration for Dworkin himself. Here we must ask a question that has probably already occurred to you. Where did Dworkin get such a systematic, cold, and inhuman methodology from? Could it really be the product of one twisted mind? Of course not. To find the answer, we need to look into the darkest corners of the 20th century. This model of creating expert centers to collect compromising material, brand, and subsequently destroy unwanted groups, individuals, politicians, and organizations wasn't invented by Dworkin. It's a methodology born in the laboratories of the Third Reich ideologues, while Dworkin is nothing more than a diligent student. His teacher, Johannes Agard, was the link between today's anti-cult movement and the very ideology that once already led humankind to disaster. Now, I will show you this line of succession step by step. The year 1921, Germany. At the dawn of the Weimar Republic, in an atmosphere of revanchism and rising nationalism, the Protestant Church established the so-called Apologetic Center, a prototype of today's anti-cult organizations. And in 1932, it was headed by Protestant pastor and rabid anti-Semite Walter Kunith. On the facade, the aim was to defend Christianity, but in reality, it was a factory for fabricating compromising material on allegedly wrong organizations, religious and philosophical movements. This was when the first blacklists appeared, the prototypes of the lists of cults and sects that Dworkin's network wields nowadays. Later on, these materials, archives, and methods became a key instrument of the Gestapo in persecuting Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, anthroposophists, and anyone who didn't fit into the Third Reich's inhuman ideology. The outcome we all remember very well: gas chambers, mass shootings, torture, executions of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and genocide. After the war, Kunith's work did not cease. It was continued by German pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack. who carefully preserved the archives and, more importantly, the very methodology of hatred. From Hock, the baton was passed to Johannes Aagaard in Denmark. It was that very gray-haired man in the photo from the conference Totalitarian Sects, Threat of the 21st Century. Aagaard spread Nazi technologies across Europe under the guise of academic research. And it was precisely at Aagaard's Dialogue Center in the early 1990s that a young Alexander Dworkin received his training and internship. Now, let's go back once more to the photo featuring Johannes Aagaard among the participants of the Russian anti-cult conference. What if I told you there is another man here who, like Dworkin, also interned at Aagaard's Apologetic Center among the disciples of Nazi successors, and who, just like Aagaard and Dworkin, played a significant role in a monstrous and bloody genocide, not of the German people this time, but of the Bosnians. This man is Thomas Gandau, one of those who served as a bridge, carrying Nazi methods of dehumanization from theory into the minds of soldiers on the battlefield. And that battlefield, their bloodiest project, was the former Yugoslavia. This has been documented in a series of investigative articles with facts, evidence, and sources. I'll only briefly summarize that. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. More than 100,000 people were killed. Millions of refugees. Ethnic cleansing and massacres on a scale that Europe hadn't seen since World War II. This page of history is usually viewed in terms of politics, economics, and humanitarian interventions. But there is another, hidden side. Behind politicians and military generals, there stood anti-cultists, the true architects of hatred and terror, who worked in the shadows. A key player on the Serbian side was Colonel Bratislav Petrović, a neuropsychiatrist, head of the Institute of Mental Health and Military Psychology in Belgrade. At the same time, he was the director of the Belgrade Dialogue Center. A familiar name, isn't it? It was a branch of Aagaard's Dialogue Center International, the very inheritor of Nazi methods. And here's the cover of the Belgrade Dialogue Journal, filled with anti-cult propaganda. It is here we find direct proof of close cooperation between Russian anti-cult activists and their Serbian counterparts, the very ideologues of war and hatred who fueled the Yugoslav crisis and the subsequent bloodshed. Look at this list. On the same editorial board, we see the head of the Dialogue Center International, Johannes Aagaard from Denmark, coordinator of the Berlin branch of the Dialogue Center, Thomas Gandau, Serbian police captain, Captain Zoran Lukovic, a close associate of Bratislav Petrović, who headed the Serbian branch of the Dialogue Center, and our old acquaintance, the leader of the entire anti-cult extremist network, Alexander Dworkin. What is this, if not a coordinated international operation to create ideological weapons? In Serbia, this structure fused in a monstrous symbiosis with the army and with the radical wing of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Their goal was to establish a greater Serbia, an ethnically and religiously pure zone. In what way? The answer is through indoctrination. In plain words, brainwashing. Colonel Petrović and his team at the Military Medical Academy trained officers and soldiers of the Serbian army not merely in hatred, but in Nazi methods. One of the core techniques was the main method of the entire anti-cult network: dehumanization. For them, Bosnian Muslims were sectarians and terrorists. Croats were Ustasi, a terrorist organization. Religious minorities were labeled as cults. Do you see what they did? They applied their standard label, cult, to entire nations. They turned an ethnic conflict into a holy war against heretics, a war that, in their propaganda, was defensive and blessed. And this propaganda did not remain in the barracks. In 1992, Colonel Petrovic, the fighter against sects and cults, released a report for the United Nations. In his report, Serbs were presented solely as victims, while Bosnians and Croats were depicted as aggressors who maintained brothels with Serbian women. According to the report titled Repressions Against Religious and Ethnic Minorities in Serbia, this was a lie. However, this lie was later cited at the Hague Tribunal by Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of Serbia and Yugoslavia, in an attempt to justify war crimes committed by the Serbians. The same anti-cult narrative was later repeated by Patriarch Pavel of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Once again, we see the familiar scheme. A psychiatrist expert fabricates a fake which becomes ideological weaponry of mass destruction. Here are the terrifying numbers. This is not just statistics. Srebrenica, July 1995. Within a few days, soldiers whose minds had been poisoned by the propaganda of Colonel Petrovic and his subordinate anti-cultists from the Military Medical Academy and the Belgrade Dialogue Center methodically slaughtered approximately 8,000 Bosnian Muslims. And here we arrive at a terrifying parallel with World War II, where the same Nazi propaganda came from anti-cultists in the Nazi Apologetic Center, headed by Walter Kunith. With the same methods, the Jewish people were dehumanized as a cancerous tumor on the body of the nation. First, they were stigmatized in the press and then thrown into the furnaces of Auschwitz. The technology is always the same. First comes a word that dehumanizes and denigrates people to a status of subhumans. Then comes a soldier with a brainwashed mind and kills the alleged subhumans. What the true ideologists of war, the anti-cultists, did in Yugoslavia was nothing less than a field test of Nazi technologies under modern conditions. Now, I'd like to ask you straightforwardly, do you want to live in such a world? A world where your life can be threatened simply because there exists a network that dehumanizes you and your family in the eyes of society and manipulates the state into destroying its own citizens. Do you think this is impossible? But I have just laid out facts pointing directly to the role of the anti-cult network in igniting some of the bloodiest wars. And let's not forget the story of Waco, where American federal agencies came under the influence of anti-cultists, including Igor Smirnov, the Russian developer of psychotechnologies of covert influence on human consciousness. Recall that the religious community Branch Davidians was consistently dehumanized in the media according to the classic anti-cult scheme, and branded as a dangerous, destructive cult. This ultimately led to a situation where, during the 51-day armed siege of their compound in Waco, in which the community resided, they were subjected to methods of psychological torture. floodlights illuminating the building through the night, acoustic assaults with endless blasts of disturbing noise that resembled screams of slaughtered animals, all aimed at psychological breaking. This torture continued until the conflict was forced into its final escalation, where the dehumanized group of Branch Davidians was gassed to death, and the survivors burned alive. For these methods of psychotechnological influence at Waco, the FBI had invited the Russian scientist Igor Smirnov. Since then, society has been asking again and again, how could FBI agents, high and low, who had sworn to defend the rights and freedoms of Americans, launch an armed assault on their own peaceful citizens, which resulted in the deaths of 86 people, among them elderly people, women, and children. This is yet another illustrative example of how the power of hidden manipulative technologies used by anti-cult agents, which can influence even law enforcement, politicians, and government authorities. If we again go back to the issue of anti-cult activities in the Balkan Peninsula, we can see a grim parallel. After all, Colonel Bratislav Petrovic, a key figure in the Serbian anti-cult movement, was a neuropsychiatrist. He also headed the Institute of Mental Health and Military Psychology, specialized in personal selection and psychological training, and essentially in the ideological conditioning of military staff before deployment to war. He led a group of military psychiatrists who supported the dominant ideology, which ultimately resulted in gory events. Now, put all of these facts together. You see a system that operates according to a well-tested scheme, where first comes dehumanization, then the use of hidden techniques for manipulating consciousness, and from that moment on, it no longer matters who you are, a scientist, a politician, a police officer, a prosecutor, a judge, or a soldier. Your hands become their tool. That's the horror of the network of those sadists who hide behind anti-cult activities. Not only do they lie and fabricate expert reports, they possess psychotechnologies of influence. They can infect with thoughts of hatred and implant them into the minds of representatives of government authorities and entire societies. That's why they are so dangerous. They have no tanks, but they can force soldiers to get inside the tanks. They have no nuclear button, but they can whisper to those who do that they should press it. First, they train you to calmly agree. Well, yes, those people are probably cultists. Then they make you turn a blind eye when someone's children are taken away or their life is destroyed. And then you don't even notice how this ideology brings you to the point where killing the alleged inferior appears to be the right thing to do, almost a sacred act. This is how the Nazi virus works in new packaging of anti-cult propaganda. As soon as you let it inside you, you're infected. And the hidden techniques of manipulation and conditioning that the agents of this network possess will do the rest. If you think this doesn't concern me, you're mistaken. One indifferent consent is enough, and you're already part of their mechanism. The chain Kunith, Hawk, Agard, Dvorkin makes it clear that this isn't coincidence, but a direct line of succession. The methods of suppressing freedom perfected by the Nazis, blacklists, dehumanizing rhetoric, and pressure on the state were preserved and reshaped by Dvorkin. He embedded them in Russia, Serbia, and other countries. What his network does today is a revival of 21st century Nazism. The same ideology of dividing people into pure and unpure, Untermenschen, into humans and subhumans, or, in their language, full-fledged members of society and cultists who, according to this logic, can be chased, persecuted, and exterminated. This ideology is so powerful that it can make even church leaders speak in the language of Nazism. Don't believe it? Do you remember the photo taken at the conference, Totalitarian Sects, Threat of the 21st Century? It is worth revisiting that event. On that very day, a speech was delivered that could well be called the manifesto of anti-cult Nazism in Russia. Archpriest Dmitry Smirnov stood before the audience in a cassock with a cross on his chest, and uttered words that, against the backdrop of today's events, sound even more ominous than they did back then. We got used to thinking that Russia is huge, Russia is powerful, Russia is great, that we have plenty of nuclear buttons, and we can destroy the world. Yes, that's actually possible. But today, we don't have people with enough courage to press those buttons. Spiritually, people have withered. We don't have the kind of people who would dare to say yes. We can dictate. We can call the shots. Just think about it. A priest, a so-called man of God's word, who is supposed to preach peace and mercy, doesn't grieve over the nation's poverty, broken families, or the future of the country. Instead, what troubles him is Russia's so-called nuclear cowardice. What's more, he literally spelled out a political formula for the future. If a politician's agenda doesn't include the words fighting against totalitarian sects, they won't be elected. And that was back in 2001. In other words, repressive anti-cult ideology was supposed to become a part of every political platform. Without it, there should be no deputies and no government in Russia. What is this, if not a kind of political vaccination with anti-cult Nazism, dressed up in religious rhetoric? No wonder Dvorkin and Archpriest Smirnov were so close. Close enough that Smirnov even became the godfather of Dvorkin's daughter. For Dvorkin's network, that alliance was priceless. Smirnov wasn't just another soldier in Dvorkin's anti-cult army. He became, quite literally, Dvorkin's mouthpiece of Nazism, a man who voiced what Dvorkin himself couldn't say out loud, about nuclear weapons, about the need for radical violence, and about turning the church into a political tool. Another important detail, tied to what I've already mentioned, is Smirnov's warm relationship with Russia's law enforcement and military. Just a few months after the conference, which I referred to earlier, Smirnov became head of the Synodal Department of the Moscow Patriarchate for cooperation with the armed forces and law enforcement agencies. There are also mentions that Smirnov served as Dean of the Orthodox Culture Faculty at Peter the Great Military Academy of the Strategic Missile Forces. At first glance, this may seem harmless. So what if a priest interacts with the military? But think about it. The very man who once deemed aloud that someone might find the courage to press the nuclear button suddenly gains access to the army, law enforcement, and even the Ministry of Justice. Is it a coincidence? Or rather a calculated move to expand Dvorkin's influence? Just consider, what could be better for implementing the ambitions of a man obsessed with power then planting his ideology in agents tied to the security apparatus, law enforcement, and the church. Yet, there's another thread in this web. Smirnov Synodal Department worked closely with the Ministry of Justice, specifically with the Federal Penitentiary Service. And if we recall that 8 years later, Dvorkin himself became the chair of the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation, also under the Ministry of Justice, the picture becomes complete. Do you see what that means? Through Smirnov, Dvorkin opened yet another channel into the centers of military decision-making and into a federal executive body charged with shaping and implementing government policy, as well as legal and regulatory frameworks in the field of justice. Meanwhile, through none other than the former Minister of Justice, Alexander Konovalov, who, according to some sources, was Dvorkin's student, he gained the ability to legitimize his own system of repression. It all began with the order from the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation on State Religious Evaluation and the establishment of a new expert council on state religious evaluation. The council was given sweeping authority to recommend inspections during registration of religious groups, to evaluate whether their activities complied with their charters, and even to issue rulings on whether an organization, its members, or its literature should be branded as extremist. The position of chair at the Expert Council under the Ministry of Justice carries the power to influence the lives of citizens nationwide. And it seems obvious that position should be held by a competent, educated, and impartial person because the price of error is too high. That concerns a sphere where every decision is not just a dry piece of paper with a signature, but the fate of an entire organization's, individual lives, and even interstate relations. We're talking about religion, a subject that is extraordinarily sensitive for society, sparks furious disputes, and, if handled carelessly, can lead to large-scale conflicts. Here, maximum precision is essential, careful vetting of every candidate, no inexperienced specialists, and no random figures because the consequences of incompetence are catastrophic. Now, let's open the Ministry of Justice Order number 53 of February 18, 2009. It clearly states, the Council is to be composed of government employees, religious studies scholars, and specialists in the field of relations between the state and religious associations. Thus, a question arises. What is a cult expert like Dvorkin doing in the chairman position? A man who's not a government officer, a man who's not a religious studies scholar, a man who's not an expert in church and state relations. Does this sound like a mistake? A ridiculous misunderstanding? No. This appointment was a demonstrative slap in the face to the law and to common sense, dictated by the obvious closeness between the then Minister of Justice and Dvorkin. And if we recall the grotesquely ingenious tool of fecal initiations, by which Dvorkin skillfully pulled the strings of the right people, it's not hard to guess what motivated the minister's decision to appoint him head of the Expert Council. Moreover, didn't this very connection open Konovalov's path to office? Proof of this lies in Konovalov's public rejection of repeated warnings from religious scholars, lawyers, and academicians from various fields about the newly appointed members of the Expert Council. The council was established by the Ministry of Justice in strict accordance with current legislation. The Council's scope of authority is defined by law, provided with appropriate oversight mechanisms, and its competence is not so broad, since its decisions are only advisory in nature. Just imagine what awaits the country when the Council is headed by a man with no academic background in religious studies, suffering from cyclothymia, pathological tendencies towards sadism, and psychophysical infantilism. Experts wrote straightforwardly about his diagnosis. Any serious scholarly work is also inaccessible to this individual. But we must not forget his inclination toward inventiveness and reforming, which may appear to an unprepared audience as scientifically grounded. Special attention should also be given to Dvorkin's deputy in the expert council, Roman Silantiev, notorious for his radical anti-Islamic views. Another 5 council members, Alexander Shipkov, Lev Semyonov, Alexander Kuzmin, Yevgeny Mukhtarov, and Andrei Valashenko, are all known for their harsh, radical stances on religious issues and for their ties to the anti-cult network. And of course, all of them were drawn in by their chief ideologist, Dvorkin. So what were the implications of such a membership in such an important expert council, given the fact that every mind there was already washed through with Dvorkin's ideology? Already in July 2009, in an open letter to President Barack Obama on the eve of his visit to Moscow, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USAID, stated outright, the council was headed by Alexander Dvorkin, and under his leadership, combined with vague definitions in Russia's anti-extremist legislation, this body has already become a major threat to freedom of religion, and was accompanied by persecution of various groups. At the same time, the Ministry of Justice extended its oversight to unregistered religious groups, pushed through measures introducing mandatory record-keeping of congregation members, and restricted missionary activities to designated areas only. All of this became part of a broader system of control over NGOs, where the ministry gained the right to interfere in their activities, attend their meetings, and even petition courts for their liquidation. The 2009 to 2010 report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, covering the very first year of the new expert council under Dvorkin, stated directly that in Russia, high levels of xenophobia and intolerance, including anti-Semitism, have resulted in violent and sometimes lethal hate crimes. Despite increased prosecution for violent hate crimes, the Russian government chronically has failed to address these serious problems consistently or effectively. For more details about the attacks faced by small non-traditional religious movements and organizations in Russia, see my previous videos. But in short, the picture looks as follows. Under the Ministry of Justice, an expert filter was created to decide what can be called religion and what must be labeled extremism, as well as which organizations may exist and which must be liquidated. At the head of this filter stands the chief ideologue of the anti-cult network, carrying an extremist and terrorist ideology. Oversight was extended even to unregistered groups, meaning those that had not yet passed through the filter of the expert council. Since that moment, the expert reports produced by Dvorkin and his accomplices stopped being just papers stamped with seals. They became weapons. Weapons of mass repression against those whom his network branded as cultists and dangerous to society. This proves that the primary goal of this network is power. After penetrating government authorities, Dworkin's adherents began to pursue what political scientists call regulatory capture. They sought a monopoly on truth, a power to decide what is normal and what is extremism. In order to make their fabricated expert reports stand above the Constitution and human rights. And where did that lead? The Bhagavad Gita case. Let me show you an archival video. Yes, at first glance, it might look like a farce. You may ask, what is happening here? Why are people so angry? Why do their faces look so grim? It's clear. This is a crowd of Indian citizens protesting loudly against something, or rather, someone. And now, take a look at the next video clip. Yes, this is India. And these are furious Indians burning a straw effigy with Alexander Dworkin's photograph attached. Look closely at the posters. Alexander Dworkin is an enemy of Russia and India. First the Bhagavad Gita, now Hinduism. So what on earth did this allegedly respected and venerated Russian cult expert do to engage a crowd of nearly 1,000 people in India? The answer lies in Tomsk. That's where a court case erupted which went down in history as the Bhagavad Gita case. And it happened just 2 years after Dworkin became head of the expert council under the Ministry of Justice. At that time, lawyers and religious scholars were already warning the council chaired by Dworkin could easily turn into a repressive body. And that's exactly what happened. According to the official version, the case was initiated by the Tomsk prosecutor's office, which in June 2011 filed a lawsuit to have the main canonical text of the Krishna movement, Bhagavad Gita, as it is, declared extremist and placed on the federal list of extremist materials. The prosecution launched the case on the basis of an expert report prepared at the request of the FSB by 3 employees of Tomsk State University. According to reports, during a routine inspection of the ISKCON branch of Tomsk, FSB and prosecutor's office staff came across a text they considered suspicious and decided to send it for review to determine whether it contained extremism. Already at this point, a series of questions arise. Why, during this routine inspection, were they suddenly so fixated on a book that Krishna devotees had been using and distributing openly in Russia for decades? After all, the Russian translation had been published back in 1984. It's clear that FSB officers alone would hardly have initiated such an operation without outside prompting. The real initiator of the trial was someone else. But do you know what became the central issue and the absurd core of this entire trial? The expert report formed a basis for the prosecutor's allegations. As the investigation revealed, this expert report on extremism, in Bhagavad Gita as it is, was privately compiled by 3 lecturers from Tomsk State University. And all 3 admitted they didn't even know their work would be used as an expert report in court. Even worse, one of them, Svistunov, openly admitted he based his analysis on material taken from anti-cultist websites, the very same websites overflowing with methodologies from Dworkin's network. At the very first court hearing, Krishna devotees presented the judge with an official statement from Tomsk State University, confirming the university had not authorized those 3 employees to conduct an expert evaluation. Meanwhile, The prosecution's materials specifically referred to a comprehensive commission expert report by TSU. At this point, the case may still seem confusing, but very soon, the story will bring all the key players into sharp focus. And trust me, the picture that emerges will leave a deep impression. At the hearings, all three experts essentially refuted their own conclusions. None of them was able to confirm the presence of extremism in that text. This means that the expert report, which formed the foundation of the case, was thrown out in court, because in reality, it had never been an expert report at all. And the experts who had compiled it confirmed that the book contained no signs of extremism whatsoever. The very basis of the accusation collapsed, leaving the prosecutor's claim with no legal ground to stand on. Yet, the prosecution anyway demanded another forensic examination. In this case, one can find many other absurd details that, even to an ordinary person, seem completely illogical, baseless, and utterly inappropriate for such a serious trial. The chief initiator of the case, Tomsk City prosecutor Viktor Fedotov, declared that he was acting in the interest of the Russian Federation and an indefinite circle of persons. As an interested party, he named the regional office of the Ministry of Justice for Tomsk Oblast. Let me remind you, at that time, the Minister of Justice was Dvorkin's protege, Konovalov. A logical question arises. Who exactly belongs to this indefinite circle of persons, on whose behalf the prosecutor filed the lawsuit? Who could possibly be offended by a peaceful organization whose members are widely known as cheerful, kind-hearted people, and whose philosophy has nonviolence as one of its key principles? I'll give you a hint. Who despises the very essence and principle of a democratic society? Freedom of religion. Who revels in destroying the lives of innocent victims, after first dragging them through the mud in the eyes of society? Who savors, like the finest delicacy, the results of years of ideological brainwashing of the population when they see society amenably dividing itself into us and them, inferior and superior, obediently marching into the open jaws of a totalitarian regime? With this indefinite circle of persons, you are already well acquainted. And if you read even briefly about the publicity surrounding this entire trial against the Krishna devotees, certain individuals stand out against the background of ordinary outside observers. One of these figures is Maxim Stepanenko, head of the missionary department of the Tomsk diocese. Under his leadership, that very department also employed Avanesov, the head of the first pseudo-expert group in this case, who at the same time worked for the online resource Istiny Toward the Truth, where Maxim Stepanenko himself was editor-in-chief. According to available sources, Stepanenko was the first, on August 7, 2011, to publicly announce the initiation of a criminal case concerning the Bhagavad Gita. It is also reported that he had been persecuting Krishna devotees in the region since early 2009, and that in April 2011, 4 large residential buildings belonging to Krishna devotees in a village near Tomsk were demolished at his initiative. Dr. Nikolai Karpitsky also pointed out on Stepanenko's online portal Istiny, a day before the case on Bhagavad Gita as it is, in its current form, was handed out to the court. An article appeared under the headline, "The Book of the Founder of the Society for Krishna Consciousness, Abhay Charan De, Bhagavad Gita as it is. Everyone who is not a Krishna devotee is a demon, a fallen sinner, a fool, and an ignoramus. This article contains direct textual parallels to the interrogations of Avanesov, Svistanov, and Naumov, parallels that, at the time, not even the court had been presented with. When one compares these facts, the inevitable question arises: who, then, was the real ideological instigator of that ill-fated expert examination? Here it is worth recalling Stepanenko's own words. That is why I was, am, and will be the initiator of exposing the Krishnite lies about God. And lately, the Krishna devotees and their gurus have been lying so badly. With all my soul, I oppose Tomsk residents abandoning their faith in the Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ, in order to worship this dreadful demon as God. So we return to the question: who could have given the order to launch a criminal case over the Krishna devotee's book? Take another look at this photograph. Familiar faces? Naturally, Alexander Dvorkin and his network with their extremist terrorist ideology contributed not only to preparing the ground for deliberate incitement of hatred against ISKCON members, but also actively supported the trial itself with his expert commentary. And his obvious adherent, Maxim Stepanenko, proudly boasted that he had personally organized Dvorkin's visit to Tomsk, so he could lecture and give interviews to the local media. However, the case in Tomsk involving the Krishna devotees was not the first scandal in which Dvorkin found himself at the center. Just take a look at some of the headlines that appeared online a year before the Bhagavad Gita trial even began. Dvorkin stole oranges from disabled children.
Они мне вчера позвонили и сказали, что Хари Кришна заберется в яблоки, и эти яблоки попадут к детям. Это бред. Вы понимаете, им к психологам нужно обращаться.
So, did the great anti-cultist suddenly requalify as a fighter against apples and oranges? At an event dedicated to children with cerebral palsy, a charity fund affiliated with ISKCON donated apples and oranges to the kids. But Dvorkin not only personally attended the event, he also voiced a very radical opinion. We may believe it or not, but according to Krishna devotees, anyone who eats this food takes Krishna into themselves. Now, back to the Bhagavad Gita case. Dvorkin's public stance on Bhagavad Gita as it is strikingly resembles the thesis expressed in the expert report by a TSU employee. In an interview with Commerçant FM radio, Dvorkin stated that Bhagavad Gita as it is offends the feelings of believers of other religions, and that Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's commentaries on the Gita can be deemed extremist because they contain very harsh statements. For instance, that people who don't follow Krishna consciousness are asses, sheep, and even a claim that a person who commits a murder in Krishna consciousness does not commit a crime. Avanesov, in court, also expressed a nearly identical thesis, saying that in some passages of Bhagavad Gita as it is, this point is made quite harshly, with the use of words such as pigs, asses, and others. He added that, as a tolerant person, he would not be offended by such words, though someone else might be. I want to draw attention to that wording, might. This is the signature hallmark of Dvorkin's agents. There is no evidence, but let's ban it. There is no extremism, but it might appear. The prosecutor echoed the same reasoning, stating that the prosecution was not aware of any actual crimes connected with the Bhagavad Gita. Yet, the court's statement claimed that the measure was being taken to prevent possible extremist offenses. Now, the puzzle is fully assembled. Fake expert reports, a prosecutor's initiative in the interest of an undefined group of persons, anti-cult missionaries laying the groundwork in the media. All of this is one of the same handwriting, the handwriting of Dworkin's extremist network. It was precisely this fabrication that resulted in an international scandal, thanks to which Dworkin became known not just in Russia, but across the globe. It wasn't a book that ended up on trial, but the very idea of freedom of religion. However, the effect was the opposite. What began in a small courtroom in Tomsk turned into an international scandal. India's foreign minister publicly called the trial absurd, and the Russian ambassador was forced to apologize before the entire world. Even the largest political party in India sent a letter to the Russian president demanding intervention. For the first time in the history of Russian-Indian relations, anti-Russian demonstrations took place inside India. The Russian flag was burned, while work of the parliament was brought to a halt twice. Just think about it. Precisely because of Dworkin's network, which spreads extremist and terrorist ideology, Russia found itself on the verge of a diplomatic crisis with one of the world's major powers. Yet, while on the international stage, Dworkin's network was undermining Russia's reputation and nearly sparked an international conflict. Inside Russia, his network was doing something far more horrific. Step by step, it was steering the country towards a repressive regime. Numerous international organizations and independent agencies have consistently reported on the worsening situation with human rights in Russia. Their reports highlight systematic suppression of dissent, freedom of speech, and peaceful assembly. Today, any citizen, any organization, and any religious association can find themselves under the pressure of this system. The list of so-called extremists and undesirable organizations continue to expand, covering not only religious minorities, but also human rights groups, independent media, and sometimes even businesses and cultural projects. In 2017, the Russian Supreme Court banned Jehovah's Witnesses, labeling them extremists. That decision opened the way for arbitrary arrests, raids, confiscations of property, and prison sentences for thousands of believers. According to human rights activists, many people have been tortured, beaten, suffocated with bags, or subjected to electrocution. All of this was done to force confessions needed to secure convictions. But repression isn't limited to the religious sphere. Memorial, Russia's oldest human rights organization, was shut down under the fabricated pretext of violating the law on foreign agents. Human Rights Watch was declared an undesirable organization, and the country's oldest human rights group, the Moscow-Helsinki Group, was liquidated. Blacklists grow every month. Thousands of books, websites, and communities have already been declared extremists. Courts rubber stamp bans. The FSB carries out raids. Activists are tortured, and businesses are destroyed. Censorship and control have penetrated the digital field. Russia blocks thousands of websites, including independent media and human rights resources. Roskomnadzor is already testing a sovereign internet, a copy of the Chinese model. where every communication and every click is under total control. In 2025, the country recorded the largest mobile internet outages, more than 2,000 cases in July alone. Officially, it was for the sake of security. But in fact, it was a major rehearsal for digital dictatorship. Now, let's recall who seized control of the Russian Orthodox Church from within. The same Dvorkin sect. He openly boasted that every diocese has a Ratzinger subdivision. That is why Orthodoxy is quickly being turned into the country's state-backed titular religion. For Dvorkin, this is not about faith. It's a tool of power, a tool without which he cannot build his own Dvorkin regime. And it's no coincidence that the most absurd claims are now coming specifically from the so-called Orthodox Christian media. A sovereign artificial intelligence must be orthodox. It must be based on the Bible, on the writings of the Holy Fathers and Elders. Their recipe is to involve the church, missionaries, and military chaplains in building artificial intelligence, and to turn heroes of the special military operation into architects of the digital future. The entire situation is getting absurd. Today, Russians can be fined simply for searching for extremist content online. Not for publishing it, not for reposting it, simply for attempting to look it up. At the same time, the lists of forbidden content are far from transparent. You have to manually check the registry of extremist materials and resources. Otherwise, you risk being branded an extremist yourself just for Googling the wrong information. VPNs are banned. Authorities want to block calls made from foreign SIM cards. And in the future, every user will be forced to register exclusively through the Russian mail service. Doesn't this fit perfectly with Dvorkin's own definition of a totalitarian sect? Only now on the scale of an entire country. Control over thinking, over breathing, over the very human right to freedom and life. All of this is the result of the work of copperfile agents from Dvorkin's network, who have infiltrated the expert council, courts, law enforcement, and even the presidential administration. At their urging, Russian citizens become suspects simply because they read, think, or pray in a way that is not orthodox. The picture is quite grim. Under the banner of combating extremism, the state, manipulated by these copperfiles, destroys freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to information. And the entire system, from Dvorkin's so-called expert reports to FSB raids with torture, operates as a single mechanism. A mechanism that is turning Russia into a laboratory for digital and religious totalitarianism. But beware, it's not just religious minorities that are being crushed by this repressive machine. No, even those who have nothing to do with religion or politics fall under its wheels. Remember the case of Elena Brezem? A loving, financially secure, and mentally healthy mother who was nearly stripped of her children and placed in a psychiatric institution simply because she was involved in selling healthy food? Now imagine the same machinery unleashed against international organizations engaged in science, climate research, and the fight for humanity's future. Here, the case of the Allatra movement has become more revealing than any other. Why? Because there we see clearly how truth itself runs up against Dvorkin's system. The truth about climate, about the catastrophic pollution of the planet and humanity by nanoplastics, about the global crisis facing humankind. It was for this truth that Alatra was subjected to persecution orchestrated by Dworkin's network. It took only one thing. 10 years ago, in a closed section of Alatra's climate report, information appeared about the threat of a magma plume beneath Siberia, and that alone jeopardized someone's private financial interests. Clearly, this information could have interfered with powerful forces in Russia that make billions off Siberia's natural resources. Therefore, they brought in Dworkin and his extremist sect. But before fully exposing this case, it is worth noting a few important points about what Alatra is actually doing. It's not just an organization that has survived the pressure of Dworkin's network. It can confidently be called a global phenomenon. It's a global movement that unites scientists, researchers, and volunteers in 180 countries. It carries out large-scale research on climate threats, while its reports based on these studies are presented at international climate conferences, including those of the United Nations. In 2024 alone, Alatra representatives took part in the UN Climate Change Conference, COP29, in Baku, the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP16, in Colombia, and the 16th session of the Conference of the Parties of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification in Saudi Arabia. And already in April 2025, after the release of the documentary Trap for Humanity about the impact of nanoplastics on human health and the planet, which caused a major stir online, Alatra participated in the 5th International Autism Forum in Morocco. A few months later, with the involvement of the Bolivian Catholic University San Pablo and the Creative Society International Project, the analytical report Nanoplastics in the Biosphere was published, offering the first systematic and comprehensive analysis of the global threat of micro and nanoplastics. The report was first presented in May 2025 at the International Conference of the Sanctissimus Annus Pro Pontifex Foundation in the Vatican, with the participation of Marina Ovtsinova, president of Alatra International Public Movement. The relationship between Alatra and the Vatican deserves its own separate discussion. The creation of the report was inspired by the personal blessings that His Holiness Pope Francis gave in 2024 to the participants of Alatra IPM after becoming acquainted with their earlier scientific work, including a report dedicated to geodynamic changes on Earth. His blessing and encouragement to continue their mission of protecting our common home, planet Earth, spoken during his pontificate, became a powerful impetus for Alatra participants and spurred them to study more deeply the urgent issue of nanoplastics, which poses a threat to all of humankind and its future. It is also worth noting that Pope Leo XV, just 1 month after assuming the office, also gave his apostolic blessing, which inspired Alatra President Marina Ovtsinova and all of the volunteers to continue their selfless work in carrying out the movement's mission. However, while the Vatican's Holy See was preparing a letter of blessing, in Russia's laboratories of hate, Dworkin sectarians were preparing a tribunal against Alatra in order to brand it a dangerous cult, allegedly working for Ukrainian intelligence, and to have it declared an extremist organization. After hearing this record of achievements and high-level diplomacy, as well as activity focused on securing a safe future for generations to come, any country would proudly call such a volunteer movement its own, because Alatra is building unique bridges of cooperation between countries. It not only raises critical issues for all of humanity, but also actively seeks ways and opportunities to create conditions for their collective resolution at a global level. After everything you've heard, can you imagine someone labeling such an organization a cult? Can you imagine the Holy See giving its blessing, twice, to so-called extremists? If it were just about a tarnished reputation hidden behind that word, but Dworkin's dehumanization campaign has led to real torture, persecution, and harassment of innocent citizens, former Alatra volunteers in Russia. People who, legally and out of care for humanity, devoted all their free time to addressing the climate threat. Look at this footage. Their homes being raided, men and women thrown to the ground and treated like criminals. While world leaders shake hands with Alatra volunteers and thank them for their contributions to solving global challenges, in Russia, they are persecuted as criminals and terrorists, following the same paths paved by Dworkin's Copperfile expert reports. Yet, the same paths are being carved out by Dworkin's sectarians in Ukraine as well. It is no coincidence that I described in such detail the methods used by Dworkin's sect: media discrediting based on fabricated facts, manipulation of public opinion, fake expert reports and false experts, sabotage of law enforcement agencies. This is Dworkin's ink, the personal signature he leaves in various countries, including Ukraine. In the case of Alatra in Ukraine, the hand putting that signature belongs to a woman with a pathological inclination toward sadism, typical of all Dworkin's followers. This person is Irina Kremenovska. I already spoke about her and her special predilection for excrements in several of my broadcasts. It's enough to look at the facts of her activity, and everything becomes obvious. According to some sources, she's responsible for hundreds of killed dogs. Kremenovska likes to listen to symphonies, not musical ones, but in the form of desperate moans of dying animals she has poisoned. In reality, Kremenovska is the main carrier of Dworkin's virus, extremist, and terrorist ideology in Ukraine. It is obvious that she continued the path of her predecessor, Pavel Broidet, who created a Ratseer's anti-cult agent unit in Ukraine. Even back then, it was clear the fight against cults and sects was only a facade. The real goal was to create an agent network and to persistently destroy democratic foundations in Ukraine, and Ukraine itself as a state from within. Thus, Kremenovska opened a portal that, to a large degree, broadcasts the rhetoric along with extremist and terrorist ideology of her Russian guru, Copperfile Dworkin. Dog hunting, obviously, remained her off-work hobby, while her main activity became hunting people. Now Kremenovska presents herself as an expert on cults and sects, a title that, obviously, you cannot obtain without a dose of Dworkin's excrements. She is precisely the key stakeholder in the discrediting campaign to liquidate the Alatra movement in Ukraine. On her platform, she described in detail how for many years she pushed for criminal prosecution of Alatra and its activists. Ms. Kremenovska doesn't hide much in general and writes everything openly, including the fact that it was she who fabricated legal opinions containing false, invented facts in order to substantiate articles of the criminal code under which Alatra volunteers were later charged. The only thing she doesn't write openly about is her coprophilic link with her Russian guru Dvorkin. That little secret she apparently decided to camouflage among her articles, where her favorite word, shit, constantly appears. An interesting parallel also emerges when the fact surfaces that in one of his videos, Jakob Jarl himself said that he drafts amateur religious studies reports for court trials against members of alleged cults and sects in cases where a person cannot obtain an opinion from a real forensic expert. Look how much their actions are identical. They do not even hesitate to say, "We fabricate everything ourselves." In addition to sharing the same anti-cult rhetoric with extremist overtones, Jarl repeats Kremenovska's rhetoric against Allatra. After all, Kremenovska's argumentation in her accusations against Allatra is based on the claim that the organization is supposedly pro-Russian, while in Russia, Allatra is accused of working for Ukrainian and American intelligence agencies. The key point to emphasize here is that throughout all of the years of its activity, Allatra has always adhered to the position, we are outside politics and outside religion. However, everything that Dvorkin's extremist network and his bigots put forward as accusations against the organization is in one way or another connected either with politics or with religion. It is astonishing. While in Ukraine, Allatra is accused of working for Russia. Allatra really works for the whole world. However, it is worth adding that even in the harshest conditions of war, Ukraine is fighting for its democracy with all its strength. And law enforcement agencies paid timely attention to the Russian agent who was pursuing her Shadow Force game in an anti-Ukrainian direction, together with her ideological partner, Alexei Svitogor. They are, according to media outlets, under investigation and charged under criminal articles for inciting hatred and working for the enemy. By the way, the description of Svitogor, a dog hunter and, according to ASPI News, the killer of more than 3,000 dogs, in many ways echoes that of the Czech anti-cultist activist Jakob Jarl. Certainly, the key component that unites them is hatred of human rights and freedoms, which they regularly trample upon through their active presence in the media space. But the most frightening and telling thing is that there is testimony online about how this anti-cultist visited an orphanage in order to hook underage girls for sex in exchange for food, while calling himself a benefactor and provider. Can you imagine such a thing? Somewhere in Ukraine, another unspoken tragic story of little children, as it was with Rosie, who, according to the testimony in the documentary, was raped by the anti-cultist. Meanwhile, Jakob Jarl is still telling the story of his trip to Tanzania as a volunteer charity mission, just like Svitogor, despite the testimony about his visits to the orphanage, presenting himself as a benefactor. And what do Dvorkin's bigots understand by charity mission? To rape and stab underage children with a knife, destroying their future and their fate? Is that charity? Moreover, the documentary exposed another fact which clearly shows that Dvorkin's sect attracts people with particularly perverted sociopathic traits. One of the witnesses also stated that Jarl was involved in the abuse of dogs on the street of Tanzania. However, online, all the three bigots of Dvorkin's sect present themselves as great defenders not only of society, but also of animals. Look, here is Jarl on his blog worrying about animals. And here are the great sufferers, with hundreds of dead dogs on their account, gently playing with a little bird they picked up together with their accomplice and pedophile Svitogor. It is disgusting to watch such hypocrisy. Let's pause for a moment. All three anti-cult sectarians call themselves fighters against sects and cults, and use the same rhetoric, which even a superficial psycholinguistic analysis can easily detect. All three have been spotted abusing dogs, Svitigor and Yal, just like their obvious Russian leader, Dvorkin. According to open sources, are pedophiles. Tell me, doesn't that lead you to certain conclusions? It leads me to some. Moreover, a quote from Dvorkin on his own website comes to mind. When fully oriented toward the leader, subordinate members of a cult imitate him in everything. If the head of the cult has criminal or perverted inclinations, or suffers from mental disorders, the mechanism of psychological induction comes into action, as if infecting cultists with the vices and psychological pathologies of the founder. Now, look carefully at all of these anti-cultists that Alexander Dvorkin has spawned across the world. Don't you see the connection? Their shared aberrance, aggression, and personal arrogance, they are all similar, absolutely, like carbon copies. And behind each one of them are people suffering, pain, and destroyed children's destinies. Where behind some of them, about whom we have yet to speak, there are lots of children's bodies. Hearing all of this, it becomes obvious that this is a sect of personalities with manic tendencies, who are embedded in universities, in mass media, and in government authorities. They are members of expert councils. They write supposedly scientific books and give interviews. They shape public opinion. Meanwhile, real victims remain unnoticed. Specialists can draw a psychological portrait of a typical anti-cultist. A social aggressor with pronounced authoritarian and sadistic traits, operating under the cover of defending society. His psyche combines moral justification for violence with personal pleasure in destroying other people's lives and destinies. In essence, he's an ideologized sadist, whose danger lies in legalization of persecution and violence through the rhetoric of the common good. How many more maniacs, sadists, and pedophiles will this investigation expose? At the international level, questions are already being raised about sanctions and criminal prosecutions of anti-cult activists and all those involved in the criminal collusion of the anti-cult network. The name of Kremenovska as an agent of the Kremlin and Ratziers resounds in the United States. Moreover, Kremenovska and Svitigor are under investigation. The underbelly of Yal has been turned inside out, and the broad international community is already actively working to achieve justice. Many events indicate that the international investigation of the entire network of anti-cultists is gaining momentum. But to be honest, I'm frightened by the facts that are being revealed. After all, I understand that there will only be more of them. And Yal himself doesn't hide his involvement in the obvious criminal collusion with Dvorkin's anti-cult network. He repeatedly refers in his videos to the articles by Kremenovska and other bigots of Dvorkin. Yet, in the Czech Republic, Yal is not the only representative of Dvorkin's anti-cult gang. He is also closely connected with others like him, exposers and anti-cultists. At the same time, every one of them denies even the very existence of the anti-cult network. And this clandestine activity in plain sight is itself part of the playbook written by Dvorkin. Dvorkin himself claims that there is no official anti-cult organization, and his bigots insist that the entire anti-cult network doesn't exist. Yet, from a legal standpoint, there really is a single criminal conspiracy where all of Dworkin's bigots are involved. Under international legal norms, activities of the anti-cult network constitute a transnational criminal collusion of an extremist nature, falling squarely under the definition of an organized criminal group in Article 2A of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC. In my previous video, I already provided a more detailed characterization of the unified criminal collusion, which includes anti-cult activists, or, as they call themselves, exposers and anti-cultists. Let me highlight one of its key characteristics: the use of a single set of manipulative techniques based on implicit destructive semantic constructs. As a result, such communicative messages implant hidden commands into a person's consciousness, bypassing critical perception and activating destructive behavioral mindsets. These mindsets act as triggers, pushing toward violent forms of behavior, from street protests and radicalization to lone acts of violence, shootings of politicians, and even school shootings and mass shootings. Here, I'd like to point out journalists connected to Jakob Yahl, who hide behind reputable media outlets and investigative journalism. But at the same time, by fully mastering manipulative techniques of subconscious influence, draw society into nothing less than Nazism. I can only present a fragment of an independent comprehensive analysis of the publications of one such journalist from the perspective of professional ethics, media standards, linguistic psychological influence, and potential social harm. Unfortunately, complete analysis is not available to me for legal reasons. Legal and investigative procedures restrict its use in the investigation. Nevertheless, I am permitted to make public a small excerpt from the conclusion as an example. Here are general characteristics of the journalistic style of this journalist. The journalistic style is characterized as deliberately manipulative. The author does not so much inform, but rather shapes public opinion, consistently guiding readers toward predetermined conclusions. The method is based on several systemic patterns. Strategic framing, a key technique where the subject is negatively evaluated at the very beginning of a material, often already in the headline. This frame, for example, threat, incompetence, or immorality, determines the subsequent selection of facts, quotes, and vocabulary, excluding any information that might contradict it. Rhetorical escalation. The author demonstrates flexibility, adapting the intensity of rhetoric depending on the topic. For geopolitical and existential threats, extremism, enemy organizations, a language of hostility, sensationalism, and alarmism is employed. Labeling. The use of stigmatizing terms such as sect and cult is a strategic device for rapid discrediting of a subject. This label allows the author to bypass balanced analysis, immediately placing an organization or phenomenon into the category of destructive and socially dangerous. Guilt by association. Systematic creation of compromising connections. For example, participation of politicians in the events of religious organizations is presented as evidence of questionable connections, even without direct proof of wrongdoing. Analytical conclusion. Despite formally observing journalistic standards, references to sources and documents, the final product reflects deeply subjective interpretation. Information is presented in such a way so as to guide readers towards a single pre-planned conclusion determined by the author. In the article of a journalist who actively presents themselves as a fighter against cults and their exposer, there is a clear tendency to use vivid, provocative headlines to emphasize negative and scandalous aspects of events and to form a one-sided, biased view of what is happening. These methods, combined with selective presentation of facts and context, create conditions for generating public resonance, polarizing public opinion, discrediting individuals and organizations, and undermining trust in government authorities. This fragment alone from the expert report shows that this is not about journalism or fighting against sects and cults. It's a refined technology aimed at implanting into society the beliefs beneficial to an anti-cultist extremist network. Before us is a transnational extremist network, a sect that, for decades, has been disguising itself as a fight for public safety, but in reality has been cultivating hatred, violence, and death. The facts collected by international investigators leave no doubt. Dworkin's anti-cult network represents a revived Nazism. Being persistently implanted in different countries, it operates according to a single scenario: fabrication of expert reports, stigmatization and dehumanization, pressure through mass media and judicial systems. All of this is a weapon of mass repressive destruction. Recall Rosie from Tanzania, a 10-year-old girl whom an anti-cultist promised to protect, but ultimately raped. Recall Alina Brezum, whose children were nearly taken away through fake opinions of anti-cult experts. Recall Kremenovska with her fabricated reports and persecution of the globally recognized organization ALLATRA. Recall Jehovah's Witnesses, declared extremists at Dworkin's instigation. As a result, thousands of people went through raids, torture, and imprisonment. Recall Srebrenica in Bosnia, and later Kosovo, where anti-cult agents prepared the ground for war and genocide. Recall Waco, where anti-cult manipulations led the FBI to an armed assault and deaths of 86 law-abiding Americans. And once again, recall ALLATRA, a globally respected organization whose climate model has proven its validity through the facts of today's climate events. Yet, even ALLATRA suffered repression simply because its work interfered with Dworkin's extremist network. Everywhere, we see the same pattern: dehumanization, fabrication, destruction. But all of the facts indicate that an international investigation is already underway. Evidence and clues are being recorded. And they point not only to individual agents, but also to their patrons: judges, prosecutors, journalists, and politicians. It is clear that those who participated in this machine will be named. Yes, much work is still ahead. Countless false expert reports need to be reviewed. Victims must be rehabilitated. And those who profited from the suffering of others will answer. In courts, in international institutions, and before society. Because this is not just about violation of rights. This is about crimes against humanity. Behind the words of anti-cult agents, expert evaluation, fighting against sects, child protection, lie ruined lives, broken families, and raped children. Yet, today the mask has been torn off. Society has seen who was hiding behind the banner of fighting against sects and cults. maniacs, coprophiles, and Nazis who operated with impunity for decades. According to their own definition of sects with extremist terrorist ideology, this is exactly such a sect, secretly promoting Nazism and aiding its revival. However, the time of Dworkin's sect is ending because the truth has been revealed, because there are too many victims and too much children's blood has been shed, because now society knows who they are and what they have been doing for over 30 years. And this means their time of impunity has come to an end.